thanks for the insight as well. Please stay on because we are going into the panel section just now.
Okay.
Yeah, with the panel as well. Yeah, can you please turn your camera, Lilian? Thanks. So yeah, it has been a quite informative presentation from both of you, I think. I'm yet to see some questions from the comments, but I have some prepared of my own. So I guess I will go with you, Lilian, first. How do you think proactive planning can aid in achieving and maintaining a sustainable food system? Your microphone is off, Lilian.
Sorry, did you direct a question to me?
Yes, I was asking how do you think proactive planning can aid in achieving and maintaining a sustainable food system?
Sorry, planning?
Yeah, proactive planning.
Proactive planning. Okay. So I'll take the case of a household with 4 people. And ideally per week, if you have a pre-planned menu, then your weekly budgeting and procurement, your weekly buying trends are going to be dependent on your menu. And the menu should actually, in most cases, what people do is that you adjust your menu to cover the foods in season because then those are cheaper. So ideally, if you have a menu, then you plan ahead about what you're going to consume during the week, and that is only what you buy. But when you don't have a menu or any plan, then your consumption patterns during the week are actually even more costly. They're not cost effective. And when you buy in bulk for a week, then you're also reducing the costs that you would incur normally to buy your food. And so if we're conscious about the meals that we are going to make, then we can also create better. I look at my household, and sometimes when I'm buying vegetables or meat, there is the way that the food will be done so that we use the vegetables, we buy enough vegetables to last us the week. So the menu from one day to the other is dependent on ingredients that are going to be more perishable at the beginning of the week, and then we move to less perishable items towards the end of the week. And so by optimizing the household menu, then I'm also saving on cost. But it's also about the fact that I'm only buying what I'm going to need in that week. Did I respond? Did I answer your question?
Yes, it did. What about you, Ife? What do you think?
Well, I think it's a very great question, Theo, and I think from the end user perspective, Lillian has really done justice to that. I think we just need to plan what we eat. We can't just continue to do what we do presently and expect the food system to be any better. We need to think about the food we eat. We need to have an approach to the way we plan our food and what we eat. And like I did mention during my presentation, what that actually does for you as a person is that it improves your access to good food. It improves your access to good health because you're eating the right food. And also, ultimately, it does help the producers, the farmers, to adopt more sustainable practices to producing food because assuming that you are able to share that information like we do have with the World Food Tracker platform, it means that we can take that information and communicate with farmers locally. Also, not just communicating with existing farmers, but spurring up the demand for more local food production because the entry farmers can see a supply chain for them to tap into. So I will encourage every end user who is with us here today in this event. If you have not been planning the food you eat, you need to rethink that today. Yeah, it's not very difficult. If you look at what you eat on daily basis, on weekly basis, it doesn't vary that much. It's just putting it down and then trying to monitor and track the quality of food you eat so that you ensure that you have the right nutritional value in what you ate. And that information will ultimately help other players within the food system. It also comes down to whether you eat in or eat out at some point. So we're not talking about the fact that you must eat in all the time. If you need to eat out once in a while, that is fine. And some families have got a pattern of the days they eat out just because they have this particular meal the children want to eat out. So you can form that as part of your meal plan. Just think about that restaurant nearby you where your child goes for that sports, or that restaurant nearby where you're staying. If they know that every Wednesday you have to come in and eat food, don't you think that they will be able to plan better and procure the food items they use more sustainably? Imagine the impact of you, the end user, on the wider food system. You hold the key to actually delivering a sustainable food system. And if only you can plan and make that information available to the wider players in the food system, you are a complete game changer within the food system. So what we're saying is this: make it a habit of planning. Use any tool available to you to be able to make that information available to other wider stakeholders within the food system. And if they're moving on from the end user to the let's say food producer, part of the supply chain, as a food producer, you farmer, by the time you have an idea of what the end users within your locality are demanding for. It simply means that adopting more sustainable practices like mixed cropping, crop rotation is not going to be onerous. And when you do that, they can also build in integrated pest management into what you do, which simply means that we don't need to use a lot of pesticides in the farm. We don't need to depend on intensive farming practices. We can adopt more sustainable approach to the way we grow food. And this is what we call taking a holistic approach and planning ahead. So by the time you have these steps to your planning, by the time you then think about the impact of every action you take on the wider ecosystem and you plan to mitigate that, this is what we call de-risking. So by the time you plan, you de-risk so many of the challenges you have, whether in the way you produce food, the way you get access to people, and how it impacts on the health of people. Then you come into the food processors and food manufacturers. Ultimately, we want to have a sustainable food system that people don't have to go hungry. So what that simply means is that if there's any overproduction by farmers, that we can turn it into useful produce that can last longer. So where that needs to take place, how do you adapt that? How do you deliver that? Is only if we have the plan in place we can achieve that. So these are the ways that planning really helps in delivering a food system, not just for the end user, not just for the food producers, not for the manufacturers or the processors, not for the retailers, the restaurants and markets, but the entire food system.
So yeah, indeed, planning has a great deal in every aspect that we do.
Absolutely.
And yeah, I'll just see that there is a question from Bahati Simeo, that apart from education to farmers about post-harvest loss, is there a response to farmers to get post-harvest loss insurance? Because it is very hard for smallholder farmers to manage post-harvest. I'll let you pick who would like to go first.
Yeah, I could start. There are a lot of efforts that are going on right now to reduce post-harvest losses or to manage production or produce after harvesting. The first one is that government is working on governments are looking at land consolidation. While this is a very strange policy for Africa, it's actually doable because with land consolidation, we identify marketable uh, priority crops, and then farmers, when a group of farmers, despite their land size, produce that crop, then there is a next level where aggregation and value addition can happen. So, if, for example, a group of smallholder farmers are focusing on potato farming, which is a priority crop for the government, then it's easy for the government to either set up a value addition or post processing plant there, And it's also easy to use other avenues such as SACCOs and cooperatives, where the farmers are registered despite their size, to aggregate that produce and support access to market. And when you take out the logistics part after harvesting, then if there is an easier access for getting that produce to the market, then you're reducing those delays that result in huge losses. And we've also seen government supporting and the private sector supporting farmers with storage, locally adaptive storage measures. For grains, we've seen these bins which protect the cereals from aflatoxins, and there are a lot that is happening to support farmers to reduce the losses that happen post harvest, both by the government and the private sector. And there is also an opportunity to use technologies to link farmers to markets. We have a lot of digital marketplaces where a farmer can anticipate their production and book for the market before they harvest, so that by the logistics are sorted and the traders know that we are picking this amount of produce from this farmer on this day. So the farmer harvests and they don't have to store, because the trader then picks that produce from the market. So with technology and even just phone connectivity, there's a lot that is happening to improve the linkages between farmers and traders or markets, to store products, to aggregate. In Rwanda, for example, the government is also working on strengthening their storage and warehouses and cold chains, so that there's easier storage. There are investments to make sure that there are storages that are accessible to a collective group of farmers. So I think those are many of the measures that are happening. I'll hand over in case there are other comments.
Well, fantastic. Great question, Theo. I think when it comes to the question that was asked by the participant with regards to how we can provide insurance for farmers, there is. I think recently we had a celebration of the World Day to combat a drought and desertification, which I think is a big challenge we have for most farmers, because definitely the food we produce is impacted by climate, and the climate is impacted by the food we produce. So I think a lot can be done in terms of providing support for farmers, and trying to mitigate against food loss and food waste. And partly that is also centered around planning, because at the end of the day, if we have the proper plan in place, we definitely will not be having a lot of the food loss, which does happen before the farm gate. And we will also be able to address most, if not all, the food waste we have post farm gate. So I think this really brings us to the topic of discussion today about planning and planning and planning, because if we fail to plan, that means we'll plan to fail. And I will encourage anyone who is participating today to also look at the Plan to Save campaign run by Intel Digest. We'll really appreciate if you can key into it and support it, because it's also a way of creating awareness and passing the message across. Different things that people can do to address the challenge of food loss and food waste. So ultimately, if I should have answered if I may answer your question, the key thing is the farmers need to engage with planning. We can't continue to do things the way we used to do it. We can just say because we have a farmland, we can just throw this crop on it and just grow it with the intent that we'll have somewhere to sell it. We can't continue doing that, and we can't continue to focus on quantity of produce, even though the practice we're using is damaging to our health and environment. We can't continue to do that as farmers, as food producers. We have to think differently, and that means we need to plan. Farmers need to engage within the food system. They can't just be, there as, farmers and producers. They need to be actively engaged within the food system. They need to be helped. So when it comes to issues of drugs and desertification, one of the things we're doing at IntelliData is looking at satellite data, looking at robotic spectroscopy within the farm to help inform the farmer. So the farmer should know when there's going to be drought, when there's going to be desertification issues, when there's going to be flooding. It shouldn't come as a surprise to the farmer. I think we've really been advancing technology that farmers should be benefiting from these technologies. It's been developed because of different other fields, people traveling to the moon and stuff. But why can't farmers benefit from it? Why can't farmers know when there's going to be flooding and plan for it to mitigate it? Why can't they know when there's going to be drought, desertification, and plan for it? This is what we need to do. This is what we need to provide. Why we need to provide enabling environment for farmers to thrive and benefit from the hard work they do. There will be some few food losses and food waste, but it can't be, you know, in such staggering numbers that we have it today if we do the right thing to plan and engage every stakeholder within the food system, especially the food producers.
Yeah, there are certainly like the long-term challenges, like desertification. I think it's happening even in Eastern Europe, especially like in like the field of like in the country of Hungary, has been going for a couple of years now. I think growing issue. Um, but yeah, talking about technology, Umilker Hassan was just asking what are the various ways technology can be integrated into food processing for sustainable food systems.
Well, maybe I should just go next since I just finished speaking. And because I've already talked a lot about technology. So is it? Let me ask you again, Theo. Are you referring to process? Is the question purely on processing, or is it across the food system?
Uh, Integrate into food processing for sustainable food system. Yeah,
So specifically on food processing.
yeah.
Okay. Well, there's a lot of advances in technology today that plays role in food systems. So I will encourage the person that asks the question to look at our webinar on engineering a sustainable food system, which we had about 3 months ago. IntelliDigest held a webinar in recognition of World Engineering Day for Sustainable Development. So we had a lot of speakers who talked about different engineering technology solutions that are available. So I will encourage participants to look at that webinar, but I'll touch on it quite briefly. So I think, most of the emerging technologies, we talk about artificial intelligence, we talk about photonics, quantum computing, data. Data is a big thing at the moment. How do you get insights from data to improve processes? We talk about green chemistry, genetics. These are kind of buzzwords we have now in terms of advances in technology. So they have key roles to play within the food system, and in particular food processing that the question was on. So within food processing, you can use photonic sensors to monitor your processing line. What that does for you is that if there is a deviation in the quality of the produce, you can be alerted in good time without the food getting to the end user and causing adverse health conditions. So these are the roles that photonic sensors can play. And combining photonic sensors and quantum computing, you can have more in-depth analysis in terms of the quality of the produce that you have, and what is the biochemical composition online without necessarily having to spend 3 days or 4 days taking your samples to the lab to analyze that. So those are things you can do. And with AI, you can do a lot of things in terms of automating so many of your processes. So any process that is repetitive, you can use AI to automate that and improve on that once you have different sensors that let you know what is going on and how you can really automate the process. In terms of green chemistry, there's a lot in terms of what you can get as output. We don't really I don't think the future is about ultra processed food. I think it's about using that information to grow more nutritious food, more diverse food that improve the health of people, and not really focusing on how you can use such technologies to produce ultra processed food, which is really most of the time damaging people's health because of the level of preservatives that need to be put in those ultra processed food to help them to last longer. Mostly when the producers produce them, they produce them quantifying that particular produce the preservatives used in them, but not really when you then accumulate the quantity of preservatives or other materials, both for emulsification purposes and for aesthetic purposes, that be added into that food item compared to eating a number of such food items, then that adds up quite quickly to have an adverse impact on your health. So what we try to focus on is moving away from ultra processed food, and when you're using advanced technologies such as green chemistry, how they use that to improve growing or selecting varieties of food crops in such a way that they have higher resistance, they have high nutritional value, and they can produce to improve the health of people.
So I suppose in a way it's using technology to reduce the amount of processing that takes place within the food system.
Absolutely. I don't know if Lillian wants to say something about it.
Do you have anything to add, Lillian, to the question, or okay? Then there's another question from Ishmael Kamlan. With the number of mouths we will have to feed by 2030, can we really avoid pesticides completely for sustainable agriculture? I suppose it also could apply to GMOs as well. Would you like to go first, Lillian?
I think that's a very it's a wide question, because I don't think that it's really just about avoiding pesticides. As you've mentioned, there are a lot of technologies and solutions that are emerging as in a bid to increase production to feed the growing population. But if I can speak to pesticides, I think there are a lot of biochemicals that can be used to support organic production. You could use cayenne pepper to spray on your crops. There are methods of intercropping that ensure that crops are supporting repelling of pests. There are ways to improve and support organic production. And we've seen a couple of those even in managing invasive species, where there are plants which can repel other plants. So there are a lot of things that can be done, but I don't think that feeding African countries the capacity to feed their growing populations in 2030 will only be dependent on that organic biochemical component. It's also about changing our approach to agriculture, because most of our agriculture is smallholder, labor-intensive production systems, and it's about switching into more sustainable and less labor-intensive and higher production systems that optimize the space that we have. Because if you look at the ecosystem, our current response to increasing production, which is usually to expand production, intensifying the areas under production, is not going to be viable in future. So it's about optimizing our current production systems. We've talked about the biggest challenge in Africa, which is actually inputs. If you look at most countries, they do not have a localized fertilizer recommendation. So it doesn't matter whether governments provide subsidies for inputs and fertilizers, we are still applying the wrong fertilizer. And then we have like an incremental set of disadvantages from wrong application of fertilizer. So it's about optimizing our inputs, it's about optimizing our farming approaches and making it more labor intensive and space dependent. But I think the most important thing for African agriculture is that it needs to stop being rain dependent. That is our biggest challenge, because with climate change, you're looking at a lot of changes in weather patterns. And so, water harvesting and less rainfall and climate dependent production is what is going to help us feed our population by 2030. And maybe another important point to add is that I was looking at some statistics about Africa, and right now, close to 70% of countries in Africa are net food importers. So, and this is very strange because of the amount of arable land that we have in Africa. So we import more than we export in terms of food, but we also have the largest amount of arable land cumulatively. It could be that part of that land is, arid, but Egypt is producing a lot of food and it's an arid country. And so I think it's about perspective and a change in our farming systems into more sustainable alternatives so that we can increase production. And again, I've seen a lot of farmers and people with very limited spaces using hydroponics and aquaponics, and they are producing a lot of food in very small spaces. So I think it's also a cultural change. It's a and sometimes culture change takes close to 10 years. So again, you're looking at what we are doing now to effect that change by 2030 so that we have sustainably transitioned our production systems to be more sustainable and viable, and to produce more without really harming our ecosystems and our environments. Thank you.
I think I'll jump in quite quickly, Theo. I think that's very fantastic contribution by Lillian. Well, I'll just say that with regards to sustainable practices, we really have a broken system globally. I know a lot of emphasis by Lillian is in Africa, but I think across Europe, Asia, and Americas, a lot has been damaged in terms of the soil, and we need to help our soil to breathe again. Our soils are not breathing anymore; they're completely dead. So we need to help our soils to breathe again. So, and there's quite a lot governments across the world doing to support farmers transition. Across Europe, a lot of farmers are being requested to retire just because. The government want to see changes within the food system, and a lot of funding is being put in place to help and enable that. So I think it, like you said, Lillian, it takes some time to have that shift, and it's not just shift for the producers, but shift for the end users. Ourselves, we need to make that shift too, because we hold the key to changing the food system as end users. We can help the farmers deliver, and I think one of the things we're trying to do to help support with that is the Global Agri-Food Techpreneur Program, where we're engaging with young graduates to be part of the food system and helping them think around the way we produce and grow food for tomorrow, so that it doesn't have negative impact. So I think we can do that. It might take some time, but we're definitely going to be able to make that transition and help to revive our ecosystem, produce more nutritious food, which will have less impact on our health and environment. And whether we can have, a pest-free food production in the future, yes, we can deliver that in the future through integrated pest management, crop rotation, and mixed farming approaches to the way we grow food. Thank you.
Yeah, attitude change is certainly a difficult process to achieve. It can take a long time, but at the same time, I think possibly the bigger negative consequences there are, the um, let's say easier it becomes or the more necessary it becomes as well. But yeah,
Yeah.
there's also a question from Christian asking, how does measuring in our food use at home achieve um, achieve an impact in climate change? Do you want to go first, Ife?
Okay. Absolutely. There's a lot that we can achieve. Like I did say earlier, the end users, we as consumers, do have the key to changing the food system, and we cannot change something we cannot measure. And this is why, if you go through the Plan to Save campaign that IntelliDigest is running, we are promoting, not just meal planning, but also being able to track, monitor your food waste and also the food you consume. So by having those tools accessible to you to do all those monitoring and tracking, you do have a lot of insight to what you're doing and how it is having an impact. And I would just want to say that, when we talk about delivering a sustainable food system, we're not talking about a climate change food system, because sustainability is really encompassing. It touches around different facets, talking about people, planet, which is climate change, partnerships, quite a number of points when you talk about sustainability and sustainable food systems. So what we're doing with regards to actions that stakeholders can take is not just talking about carbon footprint and climate change. We're looking to the bigger picture, because if you try to deal with one without looking into the other, what you try to do is to hit on a brick wall, and you're not going to make any progress. But if you take a holistic approach, and in a way that you look at people, look at profitability, look at partnerships, look at peace, touching on the key pillars of sustainability, you will be able to then deliver a sustainable food system that really meets the need. But if you try to dwell on one, the chances is that you are losing sight of the other, and at the end of the day, you end up hitting a brick wall, because they need to work together to drive the change. Thank you.
What about you, Lilian? Shall I repeat the question to you?
Yeah. So
Yeah,
I'm going to present a different perspective, you know. And so I'll give you some figures. So in Africa alone, the amount of food that is lost after harvest every year is estimated at 4 billion. That's grains alone. And this is actually higher than the total food aid that Africa has received in the past decade. But it also equates to the annual value of cereal imports. So the amount of cereals that we are importing, we would not need to import them if we optimize that post-harvest from, the point where we harvest food and bring it to the market, food that we lose, especially from our homes. So it could be that, you know, part of adaptation in reducing our carbon footprint is reducing that huge waste. Because if you look at Africa, if you go to our markets, as I was saying, there's a huge landfill in the markets with food that is perishing. And in the same town, there are people who are starving. And that food waste is contributing to a huge percentage of our emissions, especially in urban areas. So if we reduce the food that is lost after harvesting, we are reducing the amount of emissions that we are, we are reducing our emissions too, and that is contributing to climate adaptation. But the best thing is that it could be that what we need is not to produce more, but to manage our post-harvest losses, to reduce our dependence on imports and to reduce our dependence on food aid. I come from Kenya, and every year, we have a huge 70% of our country is arid and semi-arid. And so when it rains, we have floods, and when the rains dry, we have drought, and people die. If we could move food from the high production areas where people leave the food to rot in the garden because the logistics to market are actually a challenge, and get it in a timely manner to these areas that are starving, we are reducing the post-harvest losses, we are reducing our dependence on aid, we are reducing our dependence on imports, we are reducing the amount of food that we need to import. But again, as I mentioned, it also speaks to our consumption cultures. What do we term as a diet? If you ask, East Africans, if we don't have rice, if we don't have maize, and if we don't have wheat flour, we'll say we have no food. But the East African region produces a lot of millet and wheat and cassava and yams and beans. And yet, because of, I don't know, the changes, has become more modernized, then we do not count those as the main sources of food. So it's a very huge, it's a very interconnected circle. And each of these components are feeding into each other and contributing to either increasing our emissions and reducing our capacity to cope in a changing climate and reducing our capacity to feed our families,
Just a quick point to bring there. Thank you, Julian. I think you're not really. I don't think you gave a different opinion. I think what we're saying actually concur. I think the only thing is that what I was trying to say is that we don't need to focus only on climate change. We need to look at other issues, which is what you've just said anyway. So when you talk about, the people going hungry while you're dumping things in the field, and the fact that if we reduce the food loss and waste, we can get more food access to them. That is what I'm trying to say, that we just don't look at the carbon footprint alone. We look at the wider impact of our activities within the food system. But I like the way you give very specific numbers and very specific examples. But just to say, I think we really concur. It's just that you gave more illustration to it, rather than just the way I was talking about the different sustainability pillars and how they work together. Well, thank you so much.
Well, thank you for all your answers. I think it has been a wonderful panel session. And with that in mind, I think we reached the end of it. We will have a short break, and then we will be back soon in 5 minutes. Thank you once again, both Lillian and Ife, for joining.
Thanks, Steve, for having me.
Thank you.
Yeah, cheers. Bye.
Bye. Did you know? 1 in 5 deaths every year is linked to malnutrition.